So first off, I just wanted to let y'all know that the TEA has published all of your submissions to the compensation survey. So obviously, you know what you submitted for your district, but if you were nosy like me and you wanted to go poke around, see what other raises people were given, you can do that. The link is here in the PDF that I believe Christina or Oscar have posted to the site. So you can go and click that, and then not every district has submitted not every district responded to the compensation survey. So it's not an exclusive list, or an exhaustive list rather, but you can, all the ones that have been submitted are posted there. And then I think later on, TEA will come out with a statewide report, I think closer to the end of the year. But we've kind of gone ahead and done a little bit of that work. And so according to just our look at sort of where the revenues came in, where the funding came in for 1920, and we sort of calculated everyone's 30% requirement. Based on sort of what we see statewide, the 30% requirement, what that translates to in terms of dollars, is almost $1.22 billion. So because of House Bill 3, districts across the state were required to increase, were required to provide compensation increases of almost $1.22 billion. For Region 1, that requirement was $112 million. And so for all the districts and charters in Region 1, the 30% requirement equates to $112 million. And then I went through and pulled as many Region 1, as many reports from Region 1 districts that were posted. Not all Region 1 districts had reports posted, so I don't know if that's just if it wasn't submitted to the state, or you guys are submitting it to the legislature some other way, or maybe TA just hasn't posted it yet. I'm going to send a list of, Connie, I'm going to send sort of our report on that. And so you can, if you want, you can follow up with folks and kind of see where their data's at, or if they have any questions or anything like that.
I appreciate that, Josh.
Yeah.
And that's pretty amazing. So
yeah, no, it's
$112 million was required, and districts did 180 million. Wow.
Right. And so the 112 million includes everybody, right? Because we could kind of see what the funding was for everybody. But the 180 million includes probably 90%, 95% of districts. So it's likely higher than 180 million in terms of compensation actually given. And again, that's compensation increases that y'all reported for teachers and administrators and other role ID. So that's the whole thing. And we'll provide a more detailed breakout later on, but I just thought that was, y'all definitely went above and beyond for your staff there. So I think y'all should, y'all should definitely be proud of that. I think that represents a really, sound investment. So hats off to y'all for that. All right, so after the little bit of good news there, we're going to switch over to the topic that we've been kind of emailing on this week. That's not such good news. We got some details on the remote ADA cap. And again, throughout this, I'm going to stress that this is the cap for remote ADA only. Okay, as I note there in the third bullet point, in-person attendance is not subject to this cap. And this is part of this is just a 2021 creation of TEA. And just a way for them to, it's essentially a hold harmless for the state. You guys have your ADA hold harmless. They want to make sure that the state isn't on the hook for more funding than they were expecting. We can debate the fairness of that policy, but that's where they landed. And so we got some more details on that. And again, just to remind y'all, this cap is it's based on your aggregate attendance rate for 18-19. And so if your aggregate attendance rate for 18-19 was 97%, let's say, then you won't get funded for more than 97% attendance for your remote ADA. So let's say you guys are really knocking it out of the park. All your kids are marked present remote every day. You got 100% attendance. TA will not fund you at 100% remote attendance for those kids. They'll fund you they'll bring it down to that 18-19 level. And so that, in that example is 97%. And I'll kind of walk through how that's going to work a little bit more. And so here's where you can find it. Again, on that PDF version that's posted on the Region 1 website, there's a link. You can click on that, find your district. You'll see your 18-19 attendance rate. And then for almost all of y'all, the 2021 ADA hold harmless will be identical to that. I don't know if there were any new charters in Region 1 this year, or I guess, yeah, new charters since 18-19. And so if so, the TA has some alternative methodologies for calculating your attendance rate. I think it's based on a statewide average. And so if that applies to you, you'll see a note here that sort of explains why they didn't use this number, or if that number doesn't exist, what else, what other number they used. But for nearly certainly all the districts, your cap is going to match your 18-19 attendance rate. And so just to provide a little bit of a refresher, you're gonna, in the past, you just got funded on in-person ADA, right? With the waivers announced by TEA, there's now 3 streams of attendance that are sort of all coming together into your total ADA that you'll be funded on. There's remote asynchronous ADA, right, which is sort of not a Zoom session like this, not live, right? The students will log in, do their schoolwork, and have to demonstrate progress. We've talked about that a little bit. And then remote synchronous ADA, and of course, as y'all know, that's sort of a live interactive online session, kind of like what we're doing right now. And then there's just your traditional in-person ADA. So all 3 of those streams coming together equals your total ADA. The remote cap may reduce those 2 remote ADA pieces in there. And I say may because, again, it's a cap, right? So if, so in this example, this district had 1,000 ADA remote, and this represented a 100% attendance rate. However, their 18-19 attendance rate, and therefore their cap from TEA, is 97%. So what that means is that 1,000 is going to come down to 970. And so they may report 6,000 ADA to TEA, but TEA is only going to fund them at 5,970. And so now, if it were the case that, let me go back here. If it were the case that their attendance rate was less than 97%, then nothing would happen. They would still get funded at the data they report, and the remote ADA cap wouldn't come into play. So this is only going to come into play for you if your remote attendance rate is higher than the cap that is in this spreadsheet that I showed earlier. And so you may want to check with your PEIMS people, see what your remote attendance rate is, and try and just keep an eye on that, and then try and compare that with what TEA has for your district. And so the next question that I got from some of y'all after sending out that email was, okay, well, how does this interact with the hold harmless? I thought TA was going to hold us harmless to a certain ADA level. And that's still true. You guys have probably seen this spreadsheet. And there's a link again to it if you haven't. And so what TEA had also announced is that they will, because a lot of districts are worried about, and you guys have probably seen this, your attendance has not come in as high as it normally does for the school year. And so what TEA has said is that they're going to fund you based on a certain target ADA amount. And they published a spreadsheet sort of showing what all those are for your district. And again, you can download it right there. And we've kind of walked through this in the past. I'm going to quickly go through that just because I think it just kind of refresh y'all how these things will interact with each other. And so here's how the hold harmless will work. So here's for this district, here's their hold harmless level, right? So on that spreadsheet, they had 24,103 total ADA, 212 mainstream ADA, and then 8410 bilingual ADA. This hold harmless is two pieces. So I'm going to walk through them separately here. For the first piece, it looks at the average of the first 2 6-week attendance periods. Right, so it takes your attendance at the total ADA level, averages it together across these first 2 periods, compares that number with your hold harmless target. So in this first example, their ADA that they reported to the state is higher than the target, right? And so what this means is that's sort of the trigger for the hold harmless. So what that means is even though some of their student sub-pop counts were lower than their target, so in this example, their bilingual count is lower than what TEA calculated in that spreadsheet for their target, they're stuck with it. They don't get a hold harmless for these first 2 periods because the trigger wasn't pulled up here, right? Everything to get brought into the hold harmless, TEA is going to look at just your total ADA numbers. So that's what brings you in. In the second example, you can see I brought down the total ADA to 24,000. Right, so now, of course, that's less than the target. And so that triggers the hold harmless. And it replaces the total ADA with the target. And it also replaces all of the student sub-pops that are ADA and FTE. So it's going to replace all of the ADA FTEs. It's not going to replace comp ed because that's a count now. It's not an ADA or FTE. And it's not going to replace dyslexia because that's a count now and not ADA or FTE. But all the other ones, mainstream, bilingual, early ed, everything else, if it has ADA or FTE next to it, the hold harmless, if you're brought into the hold harmless, you're going to get this target that's in that spreadsheet I showed earlier. And so the thing to point out is it's going to replace your actual data that we had here in green. It's going to replace it even if the target is lower than what you reported to the state. So in this example, this district reported 250 mainstream ADA. Well, their target was 212. So even though what they reported to the state is higher, this target becomes what they're funded on, or becomes what's entered in here for the first 2 6-week attendance periods. And so TA also announced earlier this month that they're going to add a second piece to this hold harmless, right? So what I talked about earlier was just the average of the first 2 attendance periods. They're going to essentially rerun exactly what I just laid out a second time, but only looking at the 3rd attendance period, right? It's not going to be an average of all of the 3 attendance periods and then apply the hold harmless to that. They're going to run it based on the average of the first 2 attendance periods. And then you'll either be brought into the hold harmless or not based on those first 2 periods. And then they're going to run it again separately for the 3rd attendance period. And so you could get a hold harmless target on the first 2 attendance periods and not the 3rd attendance period, or vice versa. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone kind of understood how that's going to work. And so the way that sort of meshes with the remote ADA cap is they're first going to apply the remote ADA cap, right? So they're going to bring down your remote ADA, potentially. And then they will apply the ADA hold harmless. So what's in that ADA hold harmless spreadsheet? If you drop below that target, you will get brought into the ADA hold harmless. The remote cap ADA is not going to affect your hold harmless amount. So if I had a couple questions, if the ADA hold harmless brings us below that target, do we still get the hold harmless? And the answer is yes. You will get funded at the ADA amount that's in that hold harmless spreadsheet. And again, just to remind y'all, it's when I say ADA hold harmless, I mean this spreadsheet right here. And so you can see, and it's on this tab, the 2021 ADA and FTE hold harmless levels. And this is on the TEA website. The link's right there for you to go download. So I'm gonna pause there for some questions. I know there's a lot of parts to that. Let me see if there's, yeah, we got some questions in the chat. Oops. Oops, getting ahead of myself here. Yes, okay, yeah, I'll post the links in the chat right now. They can get the third 6 weeks hold harmless granted. They submit the, oh, so, right, yes, I should have mentioned that, thank you. To get the third 6 week attendance hold harmless, there's an extra attestation you have to submit that you will be, and thank you for posting that. Yeah, so it's posted in the chat. It's an extra attestation that you have to sign, and I believe your board also has to approve it, and fill out and provide some certain information to TA. But so there is another extra step to getting that hold harmless for the third attendance period. And then I'm going to go back real quickly and post the links in the chat.
And Josh, that's our super duper PEMS person, Diana Perez.
Yes.
No, but again, so hold harmless 1 could be seen as the first and second 6 weeks, the average, and then hold 3, the third 6 weeks.
Exactly right.
Okay, so. Now, going back to, as you're posting those and trying to put all
got too many screens here.
So they've got a cap on the remote, and let's just really say, because I saw some of the districts, when I saw some of the percentages, they're at 94%. I don't remember if I saw some at 92% for that, 93% for that 18-19 year. So they really could have kids that are learning remotely. I guess my concern is they're not going to get them on the in-person attendance, right? Because the kids really are remotely learning. But there's a cap to the remote learning. So I guess my point is there's a cap on the remote, and your in-person attendance could be 80% instead of your usual 96% for in-person. So it just seems like, the numbers are just all over the place, because as a matter of fact, we've got lots of real life examples, and I'm sure my colleagues out there can give us even exact numbers. People, I just heard a number this morning. One district, they were at 46 in-person attendance, 46% of their kiddos were showing up in person. They had some COVID cases. So all of a sudden they went from that 46% to 28. Folks were working up to feeling good about sending their kids back. So they were 6. And then after going up to 9 cases in one day, 0 to 9, and it was a small district, so that's pretty significant. 0 to 9 cases in one day, they come down to 28%. So those folks, that 18% gap of, hold on, I may take a little bit more time to feel comfortable with sending my child or my children back in. That's still concerned about the cap on remote learning because they're learning, and the truest test, which I still don't see how these poor folks are going to try and do some type of STAR, but I know that hasn't been changed in terms of having STAR this year. But it just seems like there's a cap in one area, but in the other area, go as low as you want, as you go. And,
Right.
and I
And
do saying
one,
that there is hold harmless. I recognize that.
One thing that's also kind of frustrating about it, I mean, there's many things, but the commissioner really touted the remote ADA as a way to, the kid doesn't have to, I mean, if an in-person kid is homesick, you can sort of capture that ADA remotely. He said that on several of the commissioner calls. And so that doesn't quite square with this cap that they're putting in place. And so just some mixed messages. And so, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I just want to make sure everyone at least understands what's happening. Maybe we don't like it, but let's first make sure we all understand what TEA is going to do. And then I had a question about, does the attestation need board approval? I thought it did. I'm going to just take a minute just to double check that. Maybe Ms. Perez could weigh in on the chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, no board approval requirement. You can submit it. Okay. Thank you for that. So yes, the attestation, you can just submit it to TEA, and I'll take a look at that guidance again. But based on what I'm seeing in the chat, you can just submit it to TEA, and they'll follow up with you on from there. Okay. So next up, Connie, you had asked to talk a little bit about voter approval tax rate elections. And so I have some slides just kind of generally outlining how your voter approval tax rate is calculated and then sort of what the implications are for that. So I'll just go through sort of this refresher really quickly. You guys already well know your voter approval tax rate for tax year 20 since you published it and everything. But I just have these years here just from a previous presentation. Also, the methodology is going to be the same next year. But sort of big picture, the way this works is it's your tier 1 M&O compressed rate, and you'll get that from TEA, right? Each year they'll do that local compression and tell you based on the local property value survey what your tier 1 rate is. And then you add to that the prior year's tier 2 pennies. And for most of y'all, if you're at $1.17 prior to House Bill 3, you guys already had adopted more than 5 pennies. And so it's going to be your tier 2 pennies. And then plus your INS rate. So all of those things together gets added up, and that is your voter approval tax rate. So it's essentially the current year M&O rate, or the current year tier 1 rate, the prior year tier 2 rate, or 5 pennies if you hadn't adopted that 5th penny yet, plus your current year INS rate. And just to kind of walk through this with some numbers. So here's an example district that had relatively slow property value growth. And so they're here, 1920, they're at 106.83. That 93 cents, as many of y'all know, that we're in this position, that gets compressed down in tax year 20 to 91.64. And then, like I said, those tier 2 pennies from the previous year just carry over. And so since this district had more than 5 pennies, right, they had 13.83 pennies, that gets carried over to the current year. And then I'm just leaving the INS rate blank for this example. But their voter approval tax rate for this year would be essentially equal to their tax rate. it would be a dollar 0547. Now, if they wanted to, and then so if they wanted to go higher than that, again, the voter approval tax rate is the rate that determines when you need a TRE, right? So in this, for this district, if they want to go higher than 10547 in tax year 20, they need to have a TRE. And so what that really means is this tier 1 rate is going to be variable from year to year, right? It's going to get compressed as their values increase, each year. So what this really means is if they want to go and access the remaining tier 2 pennies, and the cap is still 17 cents, just like it was prior to House Bill 3. So if they want to go access those remaining tier 2 pennies to get this up to 17 pennies, then they would need a TRE. And I'll kind of walk through those different zones here now. So for 20, for tax year 20, you can add the first 4 golden pennies if you haven't done that already, without a TRE and without unanimous board approval. If you want to add that 5th golden penny for tax year 20, right, you can do it without a TRE, but you need unanimous board approval. If you just have a simple majority approval, right, then a TRE would be required. Then to access all of these other pennies from 6 to 17, you need a TRE. And so for that district, the example district we talked about earlier, they had accessed all of these 13.83 pennies. And so to get these remaining 3.17 pennies on their M&O rate, they need to have a TRE. And then of course, many of y'all are aware of this, but for next summer, if you haven't adopted that 5th golden penny, you can adopt that 5th golden penny without unanimous board approval. That unanimous requirement was only for tax year 20. And so you can adopt that 5th golden penny with just a simple majority, but I think most of y'all are already above that. And then of course, there is the new efficiency requirement in House Bill 3. You have to, if you do go out for a TRE, you have to conduct an efficiency audit. One thing that's not on this slide is there is a provision that says if there's a disaster in your area, you don't have to hold this audit. I know many of the districts that are going for a TRE this year, right, they're going for it right now, they went ahead and had an efficiency audit anyway, just to really cover their bases. But there is that provision that says if there's a disaster declared, you don't have to have a efficiency audit. And those guidelines for the efficiency audit come from the LBB. If you need help finding those, shoot me an email and I can point you in the right direction there. And then of course, districts are required to pay for the costs associated with conducting efficiency audits. And then so one real hot topic of conversation is how does the COVID disaster play into TREs? Because some of y'all that have maybe been in an area where there's a hurricane or some other disaster, I think a number of Region 1 districts have sort of explored this option and adopted what we call disaster pennies. But what the tax code allows is for districts to adopt pennies above their voter approval tax rate without holding election. And they're temporary pennies. They last 1 year. And you can only do this if you're located in an area for which the governor has requested federal disaster assistance. The other important caveat there is you can adopt those additional disaster pennies in the calendar year after the disaster occurs. So with COVID, it's a statewide disaster, right? So everyone in the state qualifies there. But what a lot of districts were asking previously was, can we adopt disaster pennies in 2020? Can we adopt a tax rate that's higher than our voter approval tax rate without holding an election under this disaster penny provision? And the answer for 2020 is no. But so all the COVID related disaster pennies could be adopted in next summer in 2021. And so if that's something that your district is interested in pursuing, just know that that is an option for next summer to adopt, and everybody has tax capacity, like I mentioned in the previous slide. So because of House Bill 3, they compressed tier 1, right, $1 to 93 cents. They also compressed your copper pennies, right? So in tier 2, everybody has capacity, has at least 3.17 pennies that they can adopt in tier 2. And so if you wanted to adopt up to those, up to 3.17 pennies through this disaster penny provision, that option is available next summer. And then the last thing I was going to touch on is I got a number of questions on the prior purchase reimbursement program. There was supposed to be a training on October 16th, but I was communicating with Corey Green at TEA, and that was canceled. I think they're still ironing out the details of that program, but sort of big picture, it sounds like it's going to be similar to the TDEM program, at least in the structure. Hopefully it's a little bit more, a little bit easier to navigate and a little bit broader in the definition of eligible expenses. I know a lot of districts were really frustrated with the TDEM program just because the eligible expenses didn't quite cover all of the actual expenses they had related to COVID. And so this program may be a little bit broader than that. That's sort of what I understand now. But again, the details are being ironed out as far as I know. I'm hoping we can get some more information on the next commissioner call, hopefully next week. So that's all I had prepared for now. I don't know if you guys had any questions or if there were anything else you guys wanted to walk through. Feel free to leave some questions in the chat. Oh, actually, there's one other thing. Connie, you had asked to look at sort of state and local split, like what, looking at the sort of how your M&O funding was impacted by ESSER, right? And so what percent came from state, what percent came from local, sort of before ESSER, and once ESSER came on, how much of the state money was sort of offset by ESSER. And so I've sent this over to Connie and Oscar and Christina. I believe it's published on the Region 1 website as well. So you can kind of go and see for your district what the impact is of ESSER in terms of the state-local split. And again, this is just M&O funding. I thought that was the most sort of illustrative way to look at it. So you can just kind of see for Brownsville, for example, their local share stayed the same, right? ESSER didn't impact your local tax collections at all. But the ESSER grant brought down their state share from 85% to just over 80%. So Connie said that a number of y'all had some questions about that. And so we prepared this little report and you can kind of go and see. And so for a region-wide perspective, you can see down here at the bottom, regionally, it was 81.1% came from state, and 76 point now with ESSER sort of displaced around 4% of the state funding. And so that is, that's kind of the picture there. If you have questions about that, feel free to let me know, or any other topic I can kind of try and deal with these as they come up. All right.
This one, on this schedule that Josh is sharing right now, because I did hear from several districts very concerned about the poorer we are, or the more economically disadvantaged we are, whatever different terms were described, the less state monies we will be getting, because they took the ESSER dollars and supplanted in terms of state dollars. So you might want to take a look at this. You might want to use it at an up and coming budget workshop next, or actually just any type of report to your board that you do maybe on a monthly basis. But I can see like a 6.1% for EdCouch ELSA, the impact, versus just on what we're seeing right there, even IDEA 2.5%, and some of the lower numbers that are there, the comparisons. 5.6 for La Jolla. Josh, if you'll scroll up for me a little bit. McAllen is at 4.2. So again, the difference is the differences instead of, the state money versus the federal money. And it also highlights, if the state had just continued to do what they were going to do before the pandemic, no one knew the pandemic was coming. And how the state used it, right? Because if the state had just kept their state portion intact, then some of you would have received some much higher dollars and needed dollars. But instead now everybody somehow ended up just equalized, versus getting some really new dollars for you to spend for COVID related type expenditures. So thank you, Josh, for putting it together. I think it definitely does highlight what I kept hearing from my colleagues. And of course they were spot on in terms of, look what's happened in terms of state dollars being taken away. Yes, ESSER is there, but state dollars are definitely less. I think we have a few questions. Let's see. Angela's question, or maybe that's already been answered.
Yeah, there's no application for the hold harmless to go into effect. So that's definitely the case, Angela, for, so her question just for everyone is, there's no application for the hold harmless to go into effect. Is the only item required, the attestation. And I'm double checking that, but based on Mrs. Perez's answer, that the attestation is required to get it's just for that third attendance period. The other two will be sort of applied automatically. But for the third one, you need to submit an attestation. And I'll, give me 1 second, I'll drop some information on that here in the chat. And the next question about the operation connectivity, I have not gotten any communication from TEA on when they will have that prior purchase reimbursement program training. I think that they are just, I think they're trying to figure out how to design that program to match the resources, the state resources that are available. And so, whenever I get some information on that, I'll be sure to share it out with y'all. Let's see. Is there an updated list that bridges the census block groups into tiers? The census block groups, they have been, they are posted, so you can go and see what your census block group in your area, if they've changed. Mr. Lopez, I'll follow up with you about that, and maybe I'll include that in an email out to everybody, sort of where you can find that and how to understand the census block groups. But yeah, just to remind everyone, the way for Comp Ed, it's based on the census block groups and sort of what tier those are put in, and those tiers change every year based on the data that TEA gets from the census. And so those have been recalculated, and they'll be recalculated, pretty much at the beginning of every year. And so those have been out for a little while, but I can send out an email on where to find those resources and how you can sort of how you can calculate that for your district. And we've sort of talked about, I don't know if you guys remember, Moat Casey has a comp ed funding calculator that we put together, and we've updated that based on the new comp ed tiers. So I'll send that out as well if you wanted to, if you wanted to start putting together, an estimate for what your comp ed funding will be based on, your fall snapshot, that kind of thing. The next question was, did you do that for the entire state? I think, Janet, are you talking about the ESSER calculation? If so, yes, I did. Yes, I have that data for the entire state. Yes. And so
actually, if we could share that, I'm sure Janet's asking about the ESSER data. So if you could send that would be awesome too.
Yeah, I can send it for the whole
Some
state.
districts, the whole point, I guess, is some districts before and after ESSER, the state is the same because they didn't get ESSER or they got very little ESSER.
Right. Yeah, well, let me pull it up.
Yeah, statewide in terms of which ones look like you weren't going to gain anything.
Right. Yeah. And so I think everyone did get some ESSER, right? I mean, everyone has a percentage over here. Some of it, some of them are bigger than others. And then of course, charters don't have any local percent. That may be what you were noticing.
What about the statewide one though? That's
right. I didn't have, and I'm sorry, this total is just a region 1 total. I didn't include on this report a statewide number. I have it in my spreadsheet. I don't have it handy right now.
Okay, no worries. If we could have one that shows, the 1,200 or whatever districts and charters, that would be great.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So, okay. It looks like there's some questions. I'll just answer sort of offline about the comp ed numbers. But just one of the questions was, what happens if our block group doesn't get a tier, right? Because sometimes TA doesn't have enough data from the census to assign your block group a tier, right? If you look at your summary finance report on the comp ed detail, it has tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. Sometimes for an area of the state, they just don't know enough about it to know if it's a tier 1 block group or a tier 2. And so that may be what's going on there, Mr. Lopez, about it coming back as NA. And so unfortunately for block groups that come back NA, or there's not enough data, they get put in tier 1, the lowest funded tier. And so that could be really unfortunate if it previously was a tier 5 at the 0.275 weight, right? The highest comp ed weight the previous year, but then with some data issue, then it gets thrown into tier 1. That's a possibility. One other thing about comp ed that I didn't mention in the presentation, but that has been adopted as a recommendation by the sort of committee that advises TEA on the comp ed allotment. There was some question about how homeless students are considered for the comp ed allotment. And for 1920, the way it worked is, since they don't have an address, they looked at the address for the campus that the student attended. The way it's going to work, or at least the recommendation, I'm not sure if TA has adopted it, but I know there's a lot of legislative support behind it, and so I'm pretty certain they will. But the way this will work going forward is that they will if the student has a homeless designation in PEIMS, they'll just automatically receive the tier 5 weight for funding purposes. So they'll get funded at the 0.275 weight for comp ed.
That's good news. It's, it took them a little bit, but that's what makes a lot more sense. But that is good news that they're looking at changing. So the idea of losing funding,
to show the actual ESSER dollar amounts lost. And so I can essentially, you just want this report with dollars instead of percentages. I can send that along. You know, it's the dollars. I mean, you essentially offset the state dollars with the ESSER dollars. So overall, big picture, you still got your entitlement. Now, some of it came with a lot more red tape and extra paperwork and everything. And so I would just be cautious about how you describe it as, as losing money. Just say that, I think it'd be more accurate to say that, this money that we were expecting to come, we were expecting this money to come with certain strings attached. Then it came with a whole lot more, because of the state's decision to rely on ESSER.
And you all can unmute. Hopefully we've given you that capability, because here's where I can see it, Josh, and we're totally trying to understand what all is going on, but as a loss, because if the state just said, here's some federal money that we're now going to just give to the district, and everything else is whole. We're not touching any House Bill 3. We're not going to do this little ADA change adjustment. We're not going to supplant. Let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm. That's where some folks could say, and I could see it that way too. It's a loss. You know what, feds? Just give it to me. Just give it to me. Don't get it involved in your state finances. Just give it to me.
Right. Yeah.
And we hope that if there's another CARES or whatever if there is another funding for the districts, that the feds put more of that requirement on it. It's not for your purpose. It's for the district's purposes. It's not for your purposes, type of thing. Right. So I see what you mean. They're still at this, and I'm sure we all see what you mean. We're still at the same place. It's just when it was first announced and so forth, it really looked like new monies.
Right. Yeah. And I totally get it. And I think that given the situation and the real, need for extra expenditures that all of y'all were facing, there was a need for the state to provide more funds. Now, they failed to do that through their policy, how they handled ESSER. But maybe I'm getting too caught up in the technicalities of it, but I in terms of what putting on my sort of TEA cap, I guess they're certainly not going to describe it that way. And I just wanted y'all to understand that point at least, and just be cautious with how that's being described. I certainly think that the criticism of how their decision is definitely valid, and I certainly hope that going forward that they recognize the burden that districts are facing and provide some additional funding, because the programs they've had so far, as I've heard from all of y'all, is they're very restrictive, and there's a lot of red tape, and you got to jump through all these hoops, and not all of your expenses are covered, even when you do jump through all the hoops. And so I certainly understand the frustration. And so, hopefully that with this next program that TA is going to announce, that addresses some of that. And then, we'll just have to wait and see what happens at the federal level for that, if there's another round of funding.
Andres is asking, do you know if there will be funding? Maybe Josh, you already answered.
Funding for the
technology purchased after the Operation Connectivity Survey. That's the prior purchase reimbursement program?
So again, TA hasn't said what eligible expenses are going to be included in the prior purchase reimbursement program. I would presume that some technology items purchased after that TDEM cutoff. What was that, May 20th, I believe. I would think that those would be something that would likely be included. There could be other things. Again, there's not been a whole lot of information provided on that program other than that it will exist soon. That's all I've really heard. Just that there's another program coming and details are forthcoming. So unfortunately that's all I have to report today. Yeah, so those the technology expenses that I would think that a high likelihood that that's something that's included in that next round of funding.